Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fine, thank you very much. All the better for being able to share these fabulous stories with you. And I just want to say thank you so much to getting in touch with me, sending me those amazing comments. I'm just over the moon about them. You are so encouraging, and it's such a privilege to be able to share these stories with you, and I'm so glad you're enjoying them. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners. Are you sure it's a good idea, honey? Asked my husband. You know your father has been losing his memory of late. He seems to be forgetting things all the time. Last time we visited him, he called me Erica instead of Eric. Oh, for goodness sake, Eric, get a grip. Stop being so melodramatic. That was just a random slip of the tongue. You know it was. It's not that bad, surely. My husband looked at me intently. I hate to say this to you, honey, but I do think your father is declining in his mental faculties of late. I know you love him to death, and this is the last thing you want to hear from me. I'm not sure it would be responsible or even wise for us to leave our 7-year-old in his charge under the circumstances. Oh, don't be so ridiculous. My father's been going on and on about showing Thomas how to make a snowman. He's looking forward to spending time with his grandson. You can't take that away from him. That would be cruel. It would be a kick in the teeth for him, an encumbrance to his loneliness. Since Mum's death 7 years ago, he's been so sad, poor man. Thomas makes him feel alive again. Besides, at such short notice, who would even look after him? I know it would be a bitter pill for him to have to swallow, but we have a duty of care to our son. I'm sure Nancy would be willing to take care of him. Your sister loves Thomas. Look, I know you mean well, but I'm certain that little Thomas will be very safe with his grandfather. Besides, we're only going away for a weekend. What can happen in 2 days? You'll be surprised. A whole lot can happen. An accident can take just a second. I'm not going to sit around listening to such negative, pessimistic talk. I happen to have faith in my father, even if you don't. Thomas, are you ready? We're going to Gramps. I was grateful that I'd already packed the trunk with his suitcase, along with some groceries for my father. I wanted to leave our house as quickly as possible, before my husband persuaded me against taking our son to stay with him. My husband was so good at sowing the seed of doubt in my mind. If I wasn't careful, it might just start to germinate. Come on, let's go, Thomas. I glanced at my husband with a murderous expression on my face, as if to say, don't you dare challenge me on this one. I suppose, in truth, the very idea that my father might be in the throes of congenital decline was not something I could easily get my head around. Denial was the perfect way not to confront something that I was refusing to acknowledge. But deep down, a little voice in my gut was whispering to me, supposing Eric is right. I chastised that offensive thought, throttling it in my mind, banishing it like an unwelcome guest that I didn't want to entertain under any circumstances. My husband quickly got the message, reluctantly retreating into his shell like a tortoise, saying nothing. He knew all too well challenging me was not always a good idea, as I did have the propensity of being as stubborn as a mule at times. I'm ready, Mum, said Thomas, his eyes shining brightly. Gramps says we're going to make a big snowman with a carrot for a nose. I'm going to let it wear my scarf and woolly hat so that it doesn't get too cold stuck out in the snow all the time. Well, I'm sure your scarf will keep Mr. Snowman very nice and warm. Goodbye, Daddy, said Tommy, giving my husband a big hug. Goodbye, Thomas. Have a very good time with your grandfather. Make sure you put a button on the snowman for me, will you? I will. I grabbed Thomas's hand, feeling my husband's eyes pinned on my back. I knew he wasn't all too happy about my taking Thomas to my father's for the weekend, but very thankfully he said nothing. It was a bitterly cold winter's day, with a bracing, unfriendly, whistling wind. as we both so gratefully sank into the leather seats of the marginally warmer Land Rover that was a protective bubble, shielding us snugly against the frigid elements outside that were unrelenting in their determination to keep conditions very icy. Invariably it took a while to get the engine started, as it always does, but sooner or later we were driving down some of the snow-covered roads that had luckily been sprinkled with plenty of salt to make the journey around the area a lot more agreeable in Van Buren County in Michigan. Finally I turned right at a labyrinth of forks in the road, and before long I was driving through a large iron gate marked Quaken Aspen Farmhouse. I drove down the long ribbon of asphalt that defined my father's driveway, although of course it was lined now with snow, towards the large farmhouse where I'd grown up as a young girl, situated on 10 sprawling acres of rolling green countryside that was now so magnificently swathed with carpets of glistening white snow, while the boughs of the red alders, quaking aspen and red maple trees were now draped in scintillating glass-like crystals that caught the light so daintily, making them look like graceful Christmas trees, adorned in twinkling, semi-opaque silvery tinsels. There were hundreds of trees clustered together, like a huge gathering of people at a football stadium. They were especially abundant on the left-hand side of the property, that spread out into a sizable woodgrove, the quintessential home to a thriving deer population. I secretly marvelled at this idyllic winter wonderland that was so exquisitely beautiful. The carpets of snow made everything so quiet, as though the world was vibrantly insulated by a peaceful tranquillity. Nostalgic memories of my young life as a little girl, running through the trees, throwing snowballs with my siblings, flooded in my mind with happy thoughts. I parked my car outside the old farmhouse that had once been so beautiful in its former illustrious days, when my house-proud mother was alive. But since her death, everything had declined significantly, as my father had failed to attend to the general maintenance of the property, so it was beginning to fall apart. I'd even tried to send over a carpenter once to help with the general repairs, but my proud father would not accept my offer for help. The poor carpenter had left with his tail between his legs, deprived of a job. At least the structure of this asymmetrical farmhouse, built from wood and stone, was still solid and sound, but a few more years of wilful neglect it would eventually only be good for a bulldozer. It was amazing how the snow-covered roof disguised the full gravity of the problem, and how this ramshackle, tumble-down and shabby house had become of late, with the pale blue window frames now cracking, the roof looking as if it might just manage to remain in one piece for a few more years, if luck was still on my father's side, that is. "Are you ready to see Gramps?" I asked my son, as I parked the car under the open carport outside the house. "Yep, I'm ready. You'll be a good boy for Mummy, won't you?" "I always am good." I opened the trunk to retrieve my son's suitcase, but decided I'd bring in the groceries to the house later. I opened the front door with my key, calling out my father's name. "Dad! Dad, are you there?" There was no answer. I glanced around the place, groaning in despair. Oh no, it was a complete mess. Newspapers were liberally scattered all over the place, while ashtrays were filled with butts of cigars. The smell of aromatic smoke clung to all the furnishings like a smoggy Scotch guard. There were takeaway boxes of fried chicken, pizza, Chinese takeaways piled high in the living room, leaving an oily, greasy residue in the air. The piles of cardboard containers piled on top of each other looked like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, ominously as though they might collapse in any given moment. Then there were reminders written on pink scrap paper saying, "Glasses on kitchen counter, glasses on side table, glasses next to bed, glasses on hall table." I smiled to myself because without my father's glasses he would never be able to see his notes in the first place. My poor mother would be turning in her grave by now, if she perceived how he was actually living. I started to gather all the carnage on the floor, piling it into a black bin liner I found lying on the settee, left by my father with his good intentions in mind, that regretfully never turned into fruition. "Dad, are you there? It's only me." "Oh, hello," said my father, coming into the room. He looked a little like a mad professor, with his white hair standing on edge like a hedgehog. He was wearing a tweed jacket 2 sizes too small for him, that he'd worn when he was about 15 years old, boasting that it still fitted him today, but in truth he could barely close the buttons on the thing. It was so short on him it scarcely even reached his waist. I was trying to suppress my laughter as he looked utterly ridiculous, rather like an older man wearing a kid's blazer. I mean, seriously, did he even have an inkling of how absurd he looked? Worse still, the matching trouser pants fell at least 5 inches above his ankle. "This is a lovely surprise. Nice to see you, dear. Now I'm looking for my spectacles. I don't know where on earth they are." "Dad, you're wearing your spectacles." My father lifted his hands clumsily to his face with a rather bemused expression. Oh dear, I must be losing my mind. I was wearing them all the time. Fancy that. I'd been looking for them absolutely everywhere. Turned the entire place topsy-turvy upside down, just trying to locate them. "Gramps! Gramps!" cried Thomas in delight, running exuberantly towards his grandfather and grabbing him around his legs like an adoring dog. "How you doing, son?" said my grandfather affectionately, his crinkled face breaking out into a warm, sunny smile that reached his pale, arctic blue eyes. He ran his weathered, pigmented hands through my son's buoyant brown curls. "Are we going to make a snowman, like you promised, Gramps?" said my son. "Of course we're going to make a snowman. Just like I promised, we're going to make a very handsome snowman indeed." "Dad, are you sure you're all right? You sure you can manage looking after Thomas? You seem, well, a little confused, muddled even. I'm worried about you. Is your memory giving you problems, failing you perhaps? Now I want you to be very straight with me. I don't want to leave Thomas in your charge if you're having any difficulties in that regard." "Now, don't you worry your pretty little head, Michelle, about a single thing. I'm doing just fine. Couldn't be better as it happens. I'm looking so forward to spending time with Thomas here. We're going to have a lot of fun while you're away, eating all that naughty pizza, making snowman, playing snakes and ladders, spending quality time together. Isn't that right, Thomas? We're going to have lots of fun." "Yippee!" said Thomas. "Yippee! We're going to have fun. We're going to make a snowman." "If you're sure, Dad, you really think you can manage with Thomas? I am worried about you. You're living in a squalid mess. I hate to say it, but you are. You're eating nothing but takeaways. It can't be healthy for you at your age. I notice your fridge is virtually devoid of anything healthy. Now, I don't want to lecture you, but that's very bad. I brought you some groceries, fruit, stuff like that. You really must start taking care of yourself, Dad. I really wish you'd move into our cottage. You'll still have your independence, but we could keep a beady eye on you there. I worry about you living here on your own." "Michelle, you're just like your mother, fussing too much about everything. I assure you I am not losing my marbles, nor am I going senile. I'm perfectly happy here. Now please stop worrying your cotton socks over me. I'm big and ugly enough to look after myself. Now you go and enjoy your holiday weekend away with that handsome husband of yours. Goodness gracious, you deserve a break, the two of you. If the truth be told, Thomas and I cannot wait for you to leave us alone so we can get on with having a good time. Isn't that right, Thomas?" Thomas nodded. "Go, Mummy, go!" I kissed my father reluctantly on the cheek, not feeling totally inveigled by my father's unwavering conviction that he was indeed capable of looking after my son. I'd never seen him look so befuddled before. I secretly suspected he was beginning to forget things, become increasingly vague, ever so slightly disorientated, but I dutifully convinced myself that he was still compos mentis. Besides, I hardly wanted to drag my son away from his adoring grandfather. I could not imagine how disappointed he would be if he didn't get to build that quintessential snowman he'd been dreaming about building for weeks now. He had eagerly designated spending some quality time with Thomas. That being the case, it was with a degree of trepidation, a rising level of angst, along with a few waves of unease, that I left that farmhouse with an instinctive feeling that leaving my son in his unscrupulous charge was possibly not the most prudent decision I'd ever made in my life. Nevertheless, I pushed those vacillating, tentative, irresolute feelings aside, telling myself to have a little faith in my father. But a nagging feeling of ambivalence began to pester me, like a frenzied fly. I wanted badly to swat it. I felt annoyed with my husband, that the seed of doubt had indeed germinated. This is my father's account, in his own words. Good. She'd finally gone, I thought to myself. as I watched Michelle leaving the house through the windows in the living room. Don't get me wrong, I loved my daughter, but she could be quite intrusive in my life, putting her nose in where it wasn't wanted. I'd seen the exasperated looks on her face as she'd piled my takeaway boxes in the bin liner, a look that her mother had often worn when she was alive. I know I was a bit untidy, but I lived in organised chaos, still do, in a manageable mess. I wasn't fond of cleaning in any shape or form, so I did the bare minimum. Of course, if my wife were alive, she would be having kittens, as her feminine influences in my life have all been eroded, like the roughened rocks made smooth by a thunderous waterfall. Now it seems I've turned the house into a bit of a man cave, as instead of pretty vases of flowers dotted around the place, as in former times, there are screwdrivers, cans of paint, car cleaning products, insect repellents, tape measures and stuff like that strewn around. So there you are. But on the domestic front, I didn't see any point in cooking meals for one, so I've always ordered takeaways. I know it's not healthy, but it was more convenient for me, less expensive, leaving behind so much less cleaning for me to have to do, which is a huge bonus. Yet despite everything, I knew Michelle was right. I was becoming increasingly forgetful. This was a shameful secret I didn't want to divulge to anyone. I think I even buried it away from myself, like a squirrel stashing away its acorns for the winter. I didn't want to burden my daughter with my problems. She had enough on her plate anyway, rather than having to worry about an old man. I admit that I've arrived at the supermarket from time to time, completely forgetting why I was even there, wandering around in a mindless stupor, trying to remember what was on my shopping list, failing abysmally in recalling exactly what it was I needed, returning home with nothing that I required. Sometimes at church I forgot people's names, even though they would be on the tip of my tongue. There were occasions I was so vague that I even forgot to eat. Other times I ordered takeaways twice, forgetting that I'd previously ordered only moments before. I would end up ordering twice as much food. The delivery man told me once that it would be a lot easier if I made one large order, so he wouldn't need to keep making unnecessary trips backwards and forwards to the farmhouse. I, of course, profusely apologised for my error of judgment, but it was, of course, due to my increased forgetfulness. "Gramps, are we going to make a snowman like you promised?" "All in good time, little Thomas. Why don't I make us a nice fire in the lounge so we can get lovely and cosy first? We can have some hot chocolate with some Boston cream pie, play snakes and ladders, and then later we'll make your snowman." "Yippee! I love Boston cream pie, Gramps." Before long I was preparing a cosy fire in the hearth. My living room was ablaze with the crackling sounds of the flames, spitting, whooshing and sizzling. I proceeded to fill 2 large mugs with steaming hot chocolate. "Boston pie, Gramps! You said we were going to have Boston pie." I rifled through the contents of my fridge. "Sorry, son. I thought I bought some Boston pie. I think I must have forgotten to get it." My grandchild looked very disappointed, but a few marshmallows later, sprinkled generously on top of his hot chocolate, seemed to appease him greatly. It was later in the afternoon when we both ventured out to make our snowman. Oh, it was a perfect afternoon, so crisp, so vibrantly bright, the air so fresh, so invigorating, the snow thick, luxurious, yet lovely and wet. I began to teach my delighted grandson the art of packing, rolling, cementing, smoothing down the snow into 3 rounded balls, which we piled on top of each other to make our wonderful snowman. We then put 2 pieces of coal in for the eyes, a carrot for the nose, jelly beans for the mouth, while we put 3 coals down its middle section for its buttons, giving it a couple of twigs for the snowman's arms. I watched in delight as my exuberant, excitable grandson wrapped his warm scarf around the snowman's neck, while placing the woolly hat on his head. "Gramps, the snowman is so cool. I'm going to call him Mr. Coalbean. He's got coal for his buttons, jelly beans for his mouth. Don't you think Coalbean's a good name? It's a very nice name, Thomas. You stay there like a good boy. I'll be back in a jiffy. I'm going inside to get some coloured spray for its cheeks, and I'll get my camera so we can send your mother a picture of Mr. Coalbean. I walked into the house. My mind went completely blank. What was I supposed to be doing, I wondered. I hated it when my memory went flying out of the window like a hot air balloon. I tried desperately to catch the string so that I could retrieve the thought, but it willfully evaded me, floating away into the ether until it was out of sight. I knew I was supposed to be doing something rather significant. That irking thought itched my mind, rather like a frustrating mosquito bite that I wanted to scratch, but it had eluded me. I couldn't remember what on earth it was that I was supposed to be doing. I stood there for a moment, like a solid stone statue, trying to gather my thoughts together, like a bunch of balloons, winnowing through them selectively, so that I could get an inkling about what it was that I needed to do. In a trice it came to me, like a revelatory bright light. Of course, I needed to lock the doors of the house. That's what I needed to do. I felt frustrated that I was having these bouts of amnesia that appeared to be getting worse every day. It really was a dreadful bother forgetting things like this. It was growing dark outside, so I quickly drew all the curtains, bolting the front door along with the back door, as you could never ever be too careful. I was vigilant about my security, as getting on in years possibly meant I was becoming increasingly vulnerable. I would not need to order a takeaway this evening. I must have done a big shop, for I perceived there was a lot of food in my refrigerator all of a sudden. I had no recollection of buying any of those groceries, which was exceedingly troubling. Was I planning to go on some kind of a health kick, I wondered? I could not recall the last time I'd ever brought so much fruit. I realised the fire needed restocking with wood, so I piled it generously as it crackled away very happily in the hearth. I switched on the television, flickering on to the different stations, until I settled onto the ice hockey. I think it was the Chicago Blackhawks playing against the Boston Bruins, if my memory serves me well. Professedly, my hearing was not as it used to be, so I swiftly turned up the volume on high to enjoy the game, something that had always exceedingly annoyed my late wife, who tirelessly complained that I was going deaf. By all accounts, I began to drift off to sleep. My eyes started to close like the shutters on a window. I assume I slowly and surely nodded off to La La Land. This was Thomas's account. I was 7 years old when my grandfather fortuitously locked me out of his farmhouse. There are not many things about being 7 years old that I remember, but this is an event that is indelibly marked on my memory, as it had a profound impact on my entire life. Why was my grandfather vacillating, I wondered? He told me he would be 2 ticks, but he must be still pottering around in the house, looking for the spray paint for the cheeks. I knew he could be quite scatterbrained and dithery, as he never remembered wherever he put things. I also thought he dressed funny. The jacket he was wearing today was so tiny on him, it made him look really rather silly, but I daren't say anything. I glanced towards the house, casually observing that my grandfather had drawn all the curtains, which seemed in itself rather odd. I decided to see why he was procrastinating, but discovered to my horror that he'd locked and bolted all the doors behind him. I was very upset, as I judiciously perceived that my grandfather had forgotten all about me. I needed him to know I was locked outside. I strove tirelessly to bang at the doors as loudly as I possibly could, desperately trying to get my grandfather's attention. I called out his name at the top of my lungs. "Gramps! Gramps! Gramps! It's me! You've locked me out!" I even rang the doorbell thousands of times. It was to no avail. My grandfather did not respond. "Gramps! Gramps!" I could hear his television blaring away so loudly, drowning out all the background sounds. I knew he was in the living room warming a chair, possibly having drifted off to sleep to take a quick nap. Why, oh why, had he forgotten about me? Furthermore, he'd forgotten about poor Mr. Coalbean's cheeks. The winter temperatures had dropped significantly, as the lingering effulgence across the horizon slowly dimmed. The icy chill penetrated my clothes, robbing me of my core warmth. I was so freezing cold that even my outer garments, including my waterproof anorak, were unable to shield me from these benumbing conditions. It didn't help that a blustering wind began to howl like a pack of wolves, panelling my clothes vigorously with a biting infusion of chilly air. The last luminations of light dissipated over the valley, as if it was being sucked away by a monstrous dragon, who was now blowing out inky clouds of black smoke from his nostrils that dappled the horizon in a grim murkiness that became progressively darker and darker and darker with every passing second, so much so that it was saturated in the blackest of black. Thankfully it was made less frightful by the emergence of a half-moon and a pretty scattering of stars. The beautiful trees I admired earlier on in the day had all but lost their wondrous appeal, for they began to swagger like drunken sailors. Their snow-covered boughs jiggled, swayed, bopped up and down, looking hauntingly ominous in the moonlight shadows, making me all too mindful of ghosts, spectral beings, monsters, elves, gnomes, none of which I was desirous to see. I was always frightened of the twilight hours, so I was accustomed to sleeping with a nightlight on. Now I was abandoned, alone, trapped outside my Gramps' farmhouse. I was freezing so much that I felt as if my numb fingers were going to fall off in any given second. Every part of my tiny body was shivering, shaking, trembling, while my teeth were chattering as frenzied tears slipped down my pale, fraught face, freezing like crystallized melted candle wax on my cheeks. Then I saw him, a dark, solitary figure, the silhouette of a tall man, dressed in a very thick, warm, indistinct black coat and hoodie, walking hurriedly through the quaking aspen trees, moving his arms backwards and forwards in a vigorous, bracing, gliding motion, like a focused man with a dogged determination, on a mission with something significant to accomplish. I do remember thinking that based on the graceful way he moved with his torso sweeping up with such an impressively straight deportment, that this man must indeed be very important, for he moved in such a way that demanded great respect. My small fragile body was flooded with relief, almost as if I had beheld a twinkling shaft of sunshine now sifting through the darkness, a glimmer of hope on a cheerless horizon, a winking opportunity, too good to miss. I admit that although young, naive and impressionable, I knew this adult would be able to help me get into my Gramps' house, as older people always knew how to conduct themselves in challenging, precarious situations like this. This was my quintessential, perfect opportunity to get the help I so desperately sought. Unhesitantly, I speedily ran across the snow, my Wellington boots sinking into its sprawling white wilderness, leaving behind a trail of my footprints. I was shouting at the top of my lungs, "Excuse me, sir! Excuse me! Sir! Sir! Excuse me!" The man in the thick black coat stopped for a moment, standing very still. His large, funny-shaped head swiveled around in my direction. I ran towards him as fast as I could, until I was standing only yards away from him. This distinguishable man was poles apart from any of my father's friends. I realized under the light of the moon that basked his sizable form in an ethereal, almost luminescent glow, that he looked unambiguous, enigmatic, somewhat strange. I suspect to the casual observer this curious pilgrim appeared unnaturally large, burly, muscular, super-strong. Ostensibly his fur coat was not actually a fur coat at all, as I'd first initially believed, but was rather like a skin-tight catsuit covered in long flowing black hair. I didn't care that the stranger looked idiosyncratic or strange, for that sort of thing had never bothered me in the slightest. You see, some of the bizarre, friendly creatures in the storybooks my mother read to me were much more real to me than most people I met in my daily life. On the contrary, I felt more comfortable in this anomalous stranger's presence. Never for a moment did I feel uneasy or afraid. On the contrary, I felt really safe, now that I'd found him. The stranger wore a concerned demeanour on his human face that was oddly reassuring to me. "Please, sir," I said, pointing at my farmhouse, "please help me. I can't get back into my house. My grandfather's locked me out." The stranger studied me through his deep-set dark eyes that seemed rather kind. He spoke some strange words to me that I couldn't comprehend. I felt as if he was telling me that everything would be all right. I wondered whether he was German. I could only speak English, I told him. I pointed to my house. My grandfather's house is over there. I beckoned for the stranger to follow me. Even if he only spoke German, I thought, or some other foreign language, I knew I would be able to demonstrate to him by my actions what my problem actually was. I felt reasonably confident that he would indeed be able to help me. The stranger unhesitantly followed me back to the farmhouse, but he led the way with his fast strides, while I struggled to keep up with him, so he slowed down on my account. I was beginning to warm up as I moved my body vigorously, and the rising heat in my body helped me to feel alive again and very warm. I took the creatures to my grandfather's front door. I pointed to it, exclaiming to him that I couldn't get in. "Look! I can't get in! I can't get in! It's locked! Can you see it's locked?" I demonstrated by pushing up the door handle, up and down, whilst pushing my hands against the door. I tried to explain to him that I couldn't open. "Can you see? It's not opening." The stranger examined the door with his hands. The next thing I knew is that he lifted his feet in a high kicking position, balancing seamlessly on one leg, as he began thumping the weakest points of the door with his feet. He hit the hinges so hard that the screws went flying out of their own connections, and with one hell of a mighty crash, the door came thundering to the ground. I looked at the man in horror, wondering if I was going to get in trouble for getting a stranger to break down my Gramps' door. "I don't know if you should have done that, sir. My grandfather might be very angry." This was my grandfather's account. I woke with a start. The television was blaring loudly, but there was an ear-piercing crashing sound that was so discomposing, I almost jumped out of my skin. I was still submersed in a drug-like sleepiness, like a spider caught up in a silken web, struggling to break free. Someone was breaking down my front door. I was being robbed. I began to panic. My heart pounded thunderously in my chest like a booming drum. My breathing intensified. My throat became dry, parched, cracked. Yet my actions were stifled, suppressed, subdued by my inability to think straight, as obscure random thoughts misfired in my brain like dodgy fireworks. I was so disorientated that my rising trepidation discomposed my ability to think rationally, as all clear thinking had been expunged from me. I felt as if I'd been thumped with a stun gun. I was dithering around the place like a mindless, inebriated drunk that had lost the use of my mental faculties. Whoever was breaking in appeared to be exceedingly determined. I hastily grabbed my walking stick, trudging as fast as I could towards the entrance hall, hit by blasts of icy cold air. The front door was lying flat on the ground, having been kicked off its hinges with a violent force. I stood there like a gormless idiot. My mouth dropped open. My eyes widened with disbelief. I was unable to discern the scene unfolding before my eyes, for standing there in the doorway was Thomas, my grandson. He came running towards me, tears pouring down his face. In that second, the most horrifying revelation hit me like a brick to the head. I'd only gone and locked my grandson out on a freezing night, when he could potentially have died. What had I done? What had I done?
"Sorry, Gramps. I didn't mean for your door to break down, but I couldn't get in. It was cold and it was dark outside. But the kind hairy man with the funny-shaped head over here, well, he helped me, Gramps, but he doesn't speak a word of English."
I grabbed my grandson, eyeing the stranger in the doorway. That my grandson perceived was a hairy man, but I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. I could see the Bigfoot had saved my grandson's life. My gratitude to this creature was off the charts. He was about to glide away, but I indicated for him to stop, to wait, to come into my kitchen. The Bigfoot seemed reluctant, reticent, uncertain. He dubiously followed me. He had to bend his head under the opening where the front door had once been. He was so big that his body filled out the entire space of the door. He almost had to squeeze through it. I led the Bigfoot into my kitchen, grabbing some shopping bags, piling them high with healthy shopping that I was to later learn my daughter had bought for me. I handed him blueberries, apples, strawberries, grapes, bananas, peanuts, dried fruit, peanut butter, brown bread, honey, blueberry muffins, and a packet of cooked chicken pies. I remember the Bigfoot's face when I handed him the blueberries, 'cause they're not in season. The expression on his leathery black face was so joyous that if everybody looked like that if I gave them a present, I would be completely bankrupt because I'd never be able to stop spoiling people. The creature began to open the blueberries, popping a few in his mouth, and made a joyful whooping sound. Whoop! 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 Then we watched him leave, gliding across the snow, until he was gone from sight. Oh boy, did he move with such grace.
He's such a nice man, Gramps.
You know, Thomas, he's a very nice man. My daughter's final comments. As you can imagine, I realised something untoward had indeed happened when I arrived at my father's house to collect Thomas, as the front door was still off its hinges, which alarmed me greatly. When my father revealed that he'd locked my son outside due to his forgetfulness, I was utterly mortified. I knew that my son would have frozen to death without the intervention of that remarkable Bigfoot. The one thing that boggles my mind is the innocence of my young boy Thomas, who approached a Bigfoot for help, perceiving that he was somewhat different, but not allowing that fact to cloud his judgment. For never once did it fleetingly cross his mind that this creature should be feared. I was so angry with myself for my prideful refusal to see that my father really was suffering from congenital decline. I feared the worst, thinking that he must have the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. But fortunately, tests revealed that he just had a benign growth on his brain that was causing him to sometimes forget things, even occasionally blacking out from time to time. I'm glad to inform you that after a successful surgery to remove the growth on his brain, my father is fighting fit today. Thankfully, he moved into the flat in our yard. The old farmhouse was finally sold, but I am forever indebted to a Bigfoot for saving my son's life. For if he had stayed out all night in those treacherous wintry conditions, he would almost certainly have died. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that is the most fantastic story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.